Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. It's afternoon here on the East Coast, but most of our panelists are on the West Coast, so it's still morning for them, and I appreciate them coming out this morning for this very interesting panel. My name is Aaron Danis. I am the moderator for this panel, and we have three fantastic panelists today, Mr. Trevor Bender, Tyrone Bomba, and Joseph Miranda, who goes by Joe. And I've got some short bios on them. I'm just going to go through them quick. They really don't need much introduction, but for folks who may be new to wargaming, I'll just go over these really fast. Trevor Bender is the Chief Growth Officer at Cipher Analytics, and he's a hobby game designer. He's published at least 20 articles in industry and gaming magazines. He's designed 4 games or game expansions. He is currently working on his next game, which is of the Battle of Korea in 1950, which is going to be in C3I number 38 later this year. And his last game for C3I, Battle for Kursk, won a Charles S. Robert Award for Best Game Magazine in 2020. He's very interested in counterfactuals, and I will let him talk about that a little bit more. Bomba served 2 tours with U.S. military intelligence, and he was at the National Security Agency, or as we used to like to say when I lived in Maryland, the No Such Agency. Took him about 30 years to actually put a sign on the road pointing out where the place was. He was an analyst and intercept operator for them. He's the founding editor for Command Magazine, and he was the senior editor for Strategy and Tactics Press, and now he is the editor of Paper Wars. He's been doing this for nearly 50 years. He's published over 200 articles and has designed over 150 simulations. And I don't think, Ty, that includes all of the counterfactual scenarios that we're doing, which could almost all be separate games as well. And then last but not least, Joe is the founding editor of Modern War magazine. I was very upset when Decision Games decided to stop doing that. That was a great magazine in my book. He's also been associate editor for Strategy and Tactics and World at War magazines. He's designed over 400 published war games and 600 published articles. And he's been a consultant for organizations at the Pentagon like DARPA, Air Force Center of Naval Analysis, Center of Army Analysis. And he's a former Army officer like myself from the 80s Army, correct, Joe? You were an 80s
Yes.
Army guy, right?
Yes.
The Cold War Army? Yes.
The Army of Excellence.
All right. So today's topic is historical, counterfactual, and alternative history wargaming. It's kind of become a genre onto itself, and I'll show you that here in a minute. And we want to talk about what it is, why it's important, and look at some of the games currently being designed by these great designers. Between these 3 gentlemen, I think probably about 90% of the counterfactual and alternative history war games are being designed. So we have the right panel for today. So how did we get started in counterfactuals, or the what if question? Well, for me, it was long ago with Strategy and Tactics in the 1970s. A lot of people probably saw this ad, right? The ultimate what if I were in charge? What if I were Napoleon? What if I were Rommel, right? Or Patton or whoever, Genghis Khan. That is kind of the ultimate what if, and I think that got a lot of us involved in this hobby. For this, I'm just speaking for myself. There were a number of early wargaming efforts in the counterfactual area. I pulled these 3 out. I had to do some digging through the Speed Games Net website that Russ Howard keeps. It's a great resource if you do SPI games. One of them, the late John Young, did Lee Moves North, and he included some counterfactual scenarios in there. The most interesting one to me was you replace the entire Army of the Potomac leadership just before Gettysburg with Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan. I wonder how that worked out. Operation Olympic, designed by Jim Dunnigan himself. That was the first designed solitaire game from the ground up. And it was based on a plan that was put out there but never executed for the invasion of Japan. And then in the area of alt history, we have the ever popular, maybe never popular game Dixie. which was designed by Redmond Simonson, that postulated that the South had actually won the Civil War, and that the North and South fight again in the 1930s in a new conflict. So these were some early efforts. They may be the earliest efforts. I couldn't find any other references to early counterfactual or alt history games other than these three, and these were in the early to mid 70s. Pop culture also influenced, at least influenced me. Saturday Night Live did a series called What If back in their early iteration. These were done tongue in cheek, but they definitely had a military angle to them. If you don't recognize them, that's John Belushi in the center dressed as Napoleon. And the what if skit they had was, what if Napoleon had a B-52 at the Battle of Waterloo? And that's Dan Aykroyd on the right. And that was another counterfactual. What if Superman had grown up in Germany and had fought for the Nazis, and his big U is Uberman. So he was like Overman or whatever. But clearly the idea of counterfactuals have been around for quite a while. They have been in books, and Trevor will talk about a couple of his favorites. These are two that were somewhat recent. The one on the left, I think, was about a decade or so ago, but the one on the right is more recent. So there's plenty of material as far as background material to drive wargaming in this area. As far as some other context, and as far as setting some boundaries so we don't get too far astray, the focus of this panel is not future hypothetical war games like GMT's Next War series or Sebastian Bay's Littoral Commander, but we're going to look at more at the counterfactual, historical counterfactual gaming. I actually tried to see when these terms showed up. I looked at Bill Simpson's Compendium of Wargaming Terms, which was last updated in 2022, but neither one of them appear there. I did searches through a number of online wargaming handbooks and didn't find the phrase. I looked at some of the more notable books, Nicholas Palmer's books, Jim Dunnigan's, Mark Herman's books, and didn't see a lot as far as discussions of either counterfactual or alt history, though I did see the term hypothetical mentioned many times, but primarily looking at future war games. More recently, there's a book called Zones of Control. It's an edited wargaming compendium. The renowned Phil Sabin from the UK has a chapter where he defends counterfactual gaming in academia. Apparently, it's not popular in academia. And another author, Jeremy Antley, discusses using counterfactuals and uses the game Twilight Struggle as an example of how counterfactuals can work. So beginning to see a little bit of it more now in some of the more current works that are out there. I took the time to go through and see if I could find make a list of published article or games for counterfactual and alt history. These are over the last 3 to 4 years or so. And I tried to kind of group them together here. The first 3 are from World at War magazine. Then we have 4 from S&T magazine. We have 3 from Paper Wars. And I will point out that almost every single one of these were designed by either Ty or Joe. So, and I think the fact that a lot of these are showing up in a lot of the gaming magazines is not only appropriate, I think it's great. I think that's a great place to put new ideas, and I think it works out really well in the magazine format because you get a background article with it to help explain. Here's a few more. Everybody knows the Cold War gone hot genre is the hot genre right now, though it may be beginning to peter out a little bit. I do want to point out many of these were once hypothetical future wars back in the 1970s and 80s, but 40 years later, they're now being recycled as counterfactuals or alt history. There are other ones listed on here. I tried to spread it around a little bit, a couple from Legion Wargames, and then the last 4 are ones that were done by Trevor. He'll talk about more of those later. But you can see just on 2 slides here in the last 4 or 5 years, we've had 16 or 17 different titles in this genre, which just goes to show that it is an important genre within the wargaming community. I also would be remiss not to point out that we actually had a magazine called Counterfact Magazine by One Step Games, and the magazine is I don't know, Ty. I guess it's on hold. I don't want to call it defunct, but they have not published a new issue in a while.
It's defunct.
But there were at least 4 issues that had literally "What If" in the title. Plus, OSS published 4 other games that were counterfactual as well, or alt history. And I do want to point out, Ty published all of these, so congratulations, Ty. These were obviously well received. There was one comment here. What? No NATOs, nukes, and Nazis? Yes, it is. It's right here in the lower left on this slide. So there we go. And with that, that's kind of like my introduction to kind of set the stage a little bit. I'm going to turn it over to Trevor at this point, and I'm going to add his slide in, and I am going to drop off here, and we will let Trevor speak here, if I can get everybody. There we go. So Trevor, I'll let you speak, and I'm going to drop off the screen, and if Joe or Ty want to, they can also just blank their cameras so we retain bandwidth, and I'll be monitoring the chat function on YouTube. That is where you can post your questions. I'll be monitoring those. Now, we are planning on holding most questions until after the panelists have had a chance to present, and then we should have at least a half hour for questions. So I will leave it at that, and Trevor, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Aaron. Look forward to discussing this topic. Yeah, probably like many of you, you started looking at alternatives or counterfactuals with maybe a game like Panzer Blitz. I think they had Situation X or Situation 13, where you could create your own orders of battle and play your own game. From that, you might say, well, if I've got the toolkit there with the pieces and the maps, I could just create any battle I wanted. Or create an excursion on a historical battle. And so I want to define a few terms at the beginning here. When I talked about the word counterfactual history, especially in the sense of wargaming, I'm talking about replacing one or more variables in a particular situation, then doing a thought experiment to best determine how those changes may have impacted the outcome. Then based on that thought experiment, one could write a novel or a scholarly article or design a game to test if that thought experiment is right. And the repeated play of that game or multiple games using that same different scenario could test whether the counterfactual may have had a result in the historical result. We'll talk about some of those counterfactuals later on, but that's what when I use that term, that's what I'm saying, changing a variable. So some people will say, well, anytime you play a game, it's a counterfactual because you're the commander, you're doing something different than what was historical. As soon as you move a piece or cast a die or draw a card, play a card, you're doing something different than normal. But for the purposes of this intellectual exercise today, when I say counterfactual, I'm saying you're deliberately changing variables from a historical battle and then testing what those variables would have done, such as having forces arrive early, a different weather pattern, additional reinforcements that show up that could have been there but that weren't. Those would all be examples of variables that are changed to test a counterfactual. All right, next slide. So there's 3 different types of speculative history, which this is a term that I use, speculative history. There's alternative history, historical fiction, and counterfactual history. Let me describe each of those so we can then move on to counterfactual history and gaming. So in alternative history, the author creates a whole new universe. Harry Turtledove is one of the most prolific in that. He created entirely different universes based on the Confederates winning the Civil War or the Axis powers winning World War II. Those are fully realized universes that have their own narrative and chronology, and that's what alternative history is. You could have alternative history in gaming, such as we saw described by Aaron, the mini games that were about a Soviet-U.S. showdown in Western Europe in the 1980s. That would, in a way, be an alternative history because it never happened, but it could have. The historical fiction is a different thing. That is where the historical chronology and characters are there, but non-historical characters are introduced that interact with historical figures. Perhaps the most popular on this is the Master and Commander series by Patrick O'Brien, where you have non-historical figures interact over the age of Napoleonic sale. Now, where counterfactual history is different is you're trying to take the historical narrative but change a couple variables and then write about that or play a game about that. Let's move to the next slide and we'll see some books on that topic. All right, so one of the best ones in this genre is the What If series. There were 45 articles that were published in What If Volume 1 and Volume 2. These were all but 7 of those were military in nature. You could have a what if that's economic or business or sports, I suppose. Those would all be considered something that could be done. But for the most part, when people are looking at what if or counterfactual, you're thinking military for the most part. Excellent reads. I've read this book several times, lots of good articles in there. There's one that I really, really want to explore on the Imperial Japanese Navy premiering in Midway and what that might have done for the rest of the Pacific Theater. We'll see if I get a chance to dive into that topic later on. If you look specifically at those books on military, one of the best authors is Peter Sosaros. His Disaster at D-Day was preeminent in this. I've gone to game conventions and seen this book on the table, for example, for people playing Breakout Normandy or other games on the Normandy landings. A fabulous read with an amazing plot twist at the end. And Peter does a great job of explaining what did he change. Well, it's the whole historical chronology of D-Day, except he notes that German General Rommel was originally promised 3 extra divisions for the 7th Army at Normandy. He was not granted those, but in the counterfactual, the 12th SS Panzer Division was placed just behind the bluffs of Normandy during the bad weather that preceded the landing. And then, of course, that was disastrous to the Americans landing in Omaha. In fact, in the book, I'm not going to spoil what happens, but it's a very nip and tuck thing for those first 24 hours and tough decisions by the Allied command based on that division being there and not being discovered until the battle starts. With a detailed book like that, you can make a game. So that's what I did in my first C3 article. I took that scenario, put the 12th SS where it was in the book, in the novel, and then play out in Normandy 44 to see how it changed things. I had to add other things, though, because the Americans are going to react to this. They have the Polish Airborne Brigade that was available, was not used at Normandy, was used at Market Garden. So we added those counters in because that would be something the Allied High Command could use. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. And of course, there are several other authors that talk to counterfactual history as well. It's fun to explore them. A number of them, just go out there and find them. You'll see many of them in that What If book that was compiled as a number of short stories. So this is a compendium of the articles that I've written, 5 of which the very last one is coming out this week in War Diary number 29, Battle of the Bulge, Bitter Woods. In this particular one, we explore having the tanks go first in the Battle of the Bulge, as well as perhaps the Germans canceling other operations and putting more firepower into the Battle of the Bulge, more formations, and then what the Allies might do. In many cases in counterfactual history, when you make those variable changes, you're doing it to favor the losing side. I guess you might test something to see if the winning side could have won faster or with less resources expended. That could be a counterfactual. But for the most part, you're trying to test whether the losing side could have changed the outcome. And so in many cases, for example, in World War II, the most counterfactuals deal with changing the Axis powers situation, that they might have a better chance of winning that battle had they done something slightly different. So that's what you'll see in most of these. I just already described the D-Day situation with the 12th SS and Polish Airborne being added in Normandy 44. The next year, I followed it up with the Ukraine 43 scenario, where in that particular case, we presumed that Operation Mincemeat did not go as planned. And that was the disguise of the Sicily invasion. And instead, the Germans did not react and put more of their forces in Greece instead of in Sicily. And as a result of that and some bad weather, the Allies postponed the invasion of Sicily by a month. And in so doing, the SS Panzer Corps is not pulled out of Russia right after Kursk. And it's there when the Soviet fall offensive begins. And then you play out what would be the Soviet fall offensive of 43 with a full strength 1st SS Panzer Corps. Then Operation Market Garden. This is a wonderful battle to test a variety of what ifs. in particular drop zone and timing. In this particular case, we tested, for example, the Allies had the ability to airlift essentially a division and a quarter each day. And so instead of spreading out 3 divisions in 3 different areas as they did historically, we considered dropping all of, for example, the 101st on the first day, the 82nd on the second day, and waiting for the British 1st Airborne on the 5th day. And we tested this multiple times. And this was a case where counterfactual actually proved to be wrong. It didn't help out at all because the Germans were able to get through Arnhem with their reinforcements and get down to Nijmegen and set up a huge hedgehog that the Allies just could not get through. So they actually fared worse in this case with that counterfactual. The next one on the Russian front, this is a more strategic look at taking a broader look at World War II German strategy. Perhaps if they didn't fight the Battle of Britain where they lost 2,000 aircraft, and perhaps if they did invest resources in North Africa and put all of those on the Russian front, it might have made a difference. So in this case, we use the test bed as the Russian campaign. You could actually use any game along that same genre. The Germans kick it off a month early. They have the Afrika Korps. They have the airborne Fallschirmjäger division because it wasn't dropped in Crete, and 2,000 more aircraft. And you fight the battle from there and go forward. It turned out when we played that game, we had many cases where the games went into 1946. So I had to develop a weather pattern. What was the historical weather during 1946 to add that into the Russian campaign? And I've already described the Battle of the Bulge counterfactual there. Let's move to the next slide. Other things that I described that I'd like to explore in the future, or others can do the same thing. Disaster at Midway, where in this particular case, this scenario comes right out of that What If book, where it's a flip-flop in the carrier losses, where the Americans lose all 3 of their carriers and the Japanese lose 1 and capture the island. Now start the game at that point. So the Battle of Midway is done. These are the counterfactual results. Now, how does that change the rest of the war? Does it make a difference? The atomic bomb is on the schedule to be developed. Maybe not, maybe. So you play it out and see. With the scenario victory conditions likely making the pursuit of the war much more difficult for the Allies as the possible Japanese strategy. What if General Washington was captured in 1777? How does that affect the rest of the war? What if we added 100,000 more American soldiers into Vietnam in 1968? Is there a possible victory scenario there? What if Shiloh was fought on D-1, meaning Albert Sidney Johnston got there a day early like he was planning, but was delayed by really poor marching through bad weather the day before? And maybe a fall Blau scenario might be putting all the forces to taking Stalingrad rather than going in the Caucasus. So these are some counterfactuals that one could play and test out and see how that works out. And when they do that, they have to focus on a couple of things. And this next slide will give some basic guidelines of what to do when you're creating your own counterfactual. By the way, it's very similar to operations research, but after the fact. Operations research, which really came of its own in World War II, you would test, you would look at examples of, for example, did tracer ammunition help a fighter or not? Did it make things better or worse? In this case, what you're doing is multiple playing to the same scenario to see if it had a statistically significant difference, those variables that were changed. So first, you have to begin with a thought experiment. What do you want to test? How do you think it will play out? What happens? Then you write your scenario and test it on multiple gaming platforms, keep accurate gaming records, adjust as needed to be accurate, but also testing the variable correctly. Play balance. We as game designers, we want to design and play balance. That's what we do. We want the game to be fun. But typically, you're not going to design a game to be balanced in a counterfactual. You're deliberately changing something to give one side an advantage that they didn't have historically to see if it would have made a difference. Was that a big enough change to make an outcome in that battle? There might be multiple variables that you can tweak in a given situation. Those will all need to be tested, but then ultimately document which ones you're changing. And then don't forget there's a solitaire bias. In my game situation, most of the time I'm doing my alpha testing either on my own or with a small group of friends in Southern California. There could be introduced player bias, strategies they used before the counterfactual was developed because they like that game so much. So you have to include others and do 2 players and take yourself out of the situation and watch that play out and see what people do. So include others in your play testing styles for best results. All right, my next slide is, I think, is my last one. So about 2 months ago, my son filmed me doing about a 9-minute video on counterfactual history. It's a great listened to that describes much of what I already covered here. This is something that would help refresh your memory in the future if you want on this topic or explore it further. I really enjoy this topic. It's fun for me to do these thought experiments all the time, always looking for additional books to read. I saw what you put on there, Aaron. I wrote down a couple books that you listed that I hadn't seen before that I look forward to studying. And that concludes my presentation on counterfactual history, and I hope, and how it differs from alternate history and historical fiction, and how we can use it as a tool in wargaming. I'd be happy to answer any questions now or at the end, however we want to proceed, Aaron.
I had to add myself back to the stage. I didn't realize I had to do that. I'm learning new tricks on this StreamYard stuff every time I click around. Yeah, we'll hold questions until the end. What we'll do is we'll switch you over to Ty. So I'm going to take you off, Trevor, and I'm going to add Ty in here if we can get him to turn his camera on. And I am going to pull his slides up. And Ty, if you are there, if you could pop on. There he is. I'm going to turn it over to Ty Bomba. I've got his slides here, and I am going to drop off here. So thanks, Ty. It's all yours.
Okay. A quick word to Trevor. While your presentation was, I wanted to interrupt you about every 10 seconds to ask a question or for further application. Very, very interesting. In particular, when we get to the question and answer session at the end, if you could remind me, I would like to ask you about what your assessment is of the Germans putting the tanks up forward tactically on the first day of the Bulge, and how you see that reading out in the larger operational sense. Okay, so anyway, thanks for that excellent, thought-provoking presentation there. I feel like I don't even have anything to talk about now. Could I have the next slide, Aaron, please? Okay. Whenever I do these things, I like to concentrate on what I've got coming up in the future, as opposed to discussing my past work. That is because my professional motto is exactly the same as that: professional drag racing. That is, what is behind me is not important. So I thought I'd cover some of the stuff I have coming up. This is alternative history. It's a variant scenario, a new scenario for the 1942 game that was originally published as a old GDW 120 series game covering the Japanese campaign to take Indonesia starting in December 41 and going over into 42. It's set in 1948 in the world of tomorrow, the universe of tomorrow, the world. And the supposition is that the Kriegsmarine comes up with a plan. They seize Diego Garcia, and from there they begin the war by invading Indonesia to take the Japanese oil. So you have, I found the orders of battle for all those Kriegsmarine divisions that were put in together at the end of World War II historically, and they're thrown in here, and you've got ME-262s and Shindens and stuff like that. You can't go wrong if you put Shindens and ME-262s up in the sky. So next slide, please. Okay, this is von Manstein's Gambit. This will also be appearing in Paper Wars number 111 with the other game. It's an idea I've covered before in certain other Eastern Front designs, but this is a variant scenario for the 1941 game, which is now out in the new Compass Games edition in their World War II campaigns box. And the idea is von Manstein was very wary about the whole idea for the Kursk offensive. And he went to Hitler and said, look, we're going to do this. Let's do it big so we can really get some decisive results from it. Let's go through the army in the West and pull out every offensive capable unit that we can spare, bring it in here and go all out and see if we can achieve a victory. So it's you have the historical Soviet setup, since they're basically maxed out. And then the German sets up the historical order of battle, and he's got what amounts to 5th Panzer Army, another group of corps brought in from the West, and then you fight the campaign that way. And the idea is, of course, the goals are much more ambitious. It's the advantage of all these scenarios is you get to very intense play within about an hour or so, and they're good for two-handed solitaire play. Next slide, please. Okay. This is a December 1944 scenario for use on the 1940 game in that same package. And what I wanted to explore here in a quick, easy to play strategic format was to look at the alternatives on the Western Front that the Germans had for their counteroffensive, as opposed to just the Ardennes. So you start out with the historic setup, and then the German has 5th and 6th Panzer Army, which he may deploy anywhere along the front. Again, in a very, very short, very intense game. Next slide, please. And then coming up in I think it's 113 or 14. Well, the issue right after that. Festung Stalingrad. You play it in the southeast quadrant of the 1941 map. Again, a variant for the World War II campaign thing. I'm hoping I can convince the powers that be at Compass Games to eventually assemble all these into a second edition and put it in a box. But anyway, so both sides have their historic order of battle that engaged in that campaign. One of the advantages here is when you've got a strategic level game like 1941 and you're dealing with corps and army, which of course didn't have any set organizations, and in reality their strengths varied over the course of the longer campaign. When you come up with a sub system order of battle like this, you can adjust each unit's strength to what it was at that time. The trick here is, could I have the next slide, please, Aaron? Okay, when you start to play, you roll a die, and on a 1, 2, or 3, you get the historic scenario with no changes to either side's order of battle. One of the things that drew me into this design was that I had been tasked to write an article on this campaign for World at War, and when I did so, it really came back to me how much Hitler tried to nickel and dime this operation, despite the fact that it had 20 divisions, which by the late war standards were elite veteran divisions, and he basically trying to nickel and dime their rescue. And so I looked at were there other possible reinforcements on hand here? And so on the one hand, he could have immediately brought Army Group A back, which historically he didn't do till the beginning of January. Alternatively, he could have sent 5th Panzer Army, instead of sending it to Tunisia, send it here to Russia. And he could have done both, that is, combined both and brought them in. So at the start of the game, you roll a die to find out which order of battle reinforcement schedule the German will be working with. And as he gets more troops, his victory conditions become more ambitious and more difficult for him. Next slide, please. Okay, my current project. This was just when you think you've hit all the decision points. I was came across a reference in Morrison, Two Ocean War, that in the spring of 1943, as Tunisia was wrapping up, the planners at the Joint Chiefs of Staff were trying to come up. There was, of course, great debate over what to do next. And Churchill was very much pushing the soft underbelly idea: let's invade Sicily and Italy, and by the end of the year we'll sweep north and be at the Alps. And so the planners tried to come up with some alternatives. And one of the interesting ones that they came up with, which I think in a purely strategic sense would have been brilliant, but again, because of the clash of personalities within the overall high command, had no chance of being adapted, but it makes for an interesting game in the sense they suggested that they would take the forces that were sitting in North Africa as that front was coming to an end, basically the forces that we see historically in Sicily and at Salerno, and send them on loan to MacArthur in Australia. And he would shut down his New Guinea campaign, and he had 9 divisions at the time, and along with the Australians, take that and invade Indonesia with the idea of, in a very rapid campaign lasting no longer than a few months, take back the 11 major Indonesian oil fields. Now, what's interesting about that is if they do that, Japan is out of the war by mid-1944. Japan is about 95% dependent on Indonesian oil at that time. Now, they had done considerable stockpiling in the home islands, but there's no, if the Allies retake the Indonesian oil fields in the late summer of 1943, late summer of 1944, Japan, that's it. They can no longer run their war industries. They can no longer send ships to sea, put airplanes in the air. They are out of fuel. Now, of course, like I say, this was quickly abandoned because, Eisenhower's head would have exploded, for one thing, to send those troops to MacArthur. It would have meant he would have had a choice: either stay in Europe as the troops, disappeared over the horizon through the Red Sea and into the Indian Ocean, and thereby risk, MacArthur never giving them back, or he could go with them and then would have had to subordinate himself to MacArthur. And of course, I think it was after the war, some historian was interviewing Eisenhower, and he questioned Eisenhower about the time he had served under MacArthur. And the historian asked, well, how did that go? And what did you learn from MacArthur? And Eisenhower said, under MacArthur, I studied theater. So there was no love lost there. So anyway, this will be a new scenario for the 1942 game, assuming that they had overcome those personality problems and sent those troops there. Now, the interesting thing is, okay, this is 1943, not 1944. So the Imperial Japanese Navy and Air Force is not in the beat up condition it would be another year later. So there's considerable flow back and forth. At the same time, the Kwantung Army is largely intact. And so the Japanese player has reinforcements he can call on, from there. So it's shaping up. I think it'll be a slam banger. The cover photo here I chose for it, that's supposed to be an American soldier at one of the oil fields. They recaptured it, and it's been spritzing oil into the air, that sort of thing. So I think I'll have that ready for 117, Paper Wars 117. Next slide, please. Oh, okay, here's the map showing the 11 major oil fields. And of course, you can see the big one there, center left is Palembang, 30 million barrels. But so they'll all be on the map in the form of counters, and the Allied player can win a sudden death victory. It's a 10-turn game, each turn equal to 2 weeks. Can win a sudden death victory by gaining simultaneous control of all of the oil fields, or at the end, based on points. I had not played just for oil because, for instance, Singapore is on the map. Now, you got to know the British, had they got the chance to take back Singapore at this point, certainly would have done so. I mean, Churchill's at the helm. So, although this is primarily about oil, there are other things on the map that have to be taken into account. So, I guess, yeah. All right, next slide, please. Okay, this is coming up in World at War number 106 or 107. It is, I forget. But anyway, it's. I wanted to call it Français Outre-mer, but we went with English France overseas. And the idea is in 1940, when the French cabinet was voting on whether to continue to move to North Africa and continue to resist, they lost by 3 votes. And so my supposition here is that de Gaulle, who was in the room, pulled out his pistol, fired a few shots in the air and said, let's vote again. And, they voted again and they decided to do it. And so you had the French order battle, and as it was at the time of the surrender. And so what you put them in a cup. And the way I decided who gets away is that historically, out of every 8 Allied soldiers who were given orders to move to Denmark to move to Dunkirk rather for evacuation, 7 of them got there. So the Allied player pulls out 7/8 of the French army, and the others are considered to have been sunk or detained on the way. And then that's his order of battle that he sets up in Algeria. Now, for the German order of battle, I gave them a nascent Africa Corps, which I figured would be quickly put together and sent to Libya. It's not under Rommel's command. He is commanding 7th Panzer Division yet. And at this point, oh yeah, the assumption I had to make with Hitler, I had 2 choices, right? This been done, he could have either ignored it and gone on concentrating against England, figuring, well, I'll defeat England in the skies, and the French in Africa won't do anything. Or he could decide, well, we have to take these people out. So for the sake of the game, he decided to go after the French in a big way in North Africa to liquidate that, which I think is the more realistic, the more likely decision. So determining what ground force he would have available for this, I found the order of battle of what the army was planning for Operation Sea Lion. And he figures now he sends that into Spain. In other words, he goes to Franco and says, "You're now joining the Axis." And Franco says, "Well, I need all these supplies." And then Hitler says, "Yeah, or I could shoot you." And so Franco joins the Axis, and so the Sea Line force is now sent in to Spain and is available to cross into Africa across the Straits of Gibraltar. Now, interesting thing, of course, is the French and British Mediterranean fleets are fully available on the Allied side. So the Allied player has this immense naval strength. However, the 3 air fleets that were historically engaged by the Germans against Britain in the Battle of Britain are now available in the Mediterranean. So the Allied player has this immense naval strength. He can commit to the campaign to interdict German sea movement across the straits and reinforce the capability and such. But at the same time, then they're sending those ships out underneath 3 air fleets. And to model the combat power there, I used what happened to the British ships during the Crete campaign, the Crete evacuation in 1941. And of course, they really got their heads handed to them. So it's a race. Can they bollocks up the German reinforcements coming across the straits before the Luftwaffe gets enough, puts in enough time, and does damage? These are all battleships and battle cruisers and whatnot, and so the victory points for sinking them. You'll notice the map is split. The terrain was such that we could not link the map continuously without going over the 34 by 22 map edge. So you can either play it here as it is and cross over from one map portion to the other, or you can trim it and join it together, in which case you get a more weirdly shaped oblong map. So that's coming up there. Next slide, please. Okay, here, this is volume 3 in my alternate Battle of the Bulges series, Operation Lorraine Alsace. When I say it, everyone says Lorraine Alsace, don't you mean Alsace Lorraine? No, this was these were 2 of the options that the General Staff offered to Hitler when they were casting around, where to attack. And they came up with Operation Lorraine first, and then later on decided, well, it could also be expanded into Alsace. So they referred to it as Operation Lorraine Alsace rather than Alsace Lorraine. But anyway, you no doubt recognize this. This is the southern portion of the main front. The Allies have their historic setup from 16 December, and the Germans have their historic setup. And then to that, they add the 5th and 6th Panzer armies and cut loose with the idea of, they've also got the Colmar pocket there, if you can, toward the right side within that red dotted line. And so they still got some terrain on the west bank of the Rhine. And so there are several strategies. You can the German can win by simply trying to retreat away through an army and wreck Patton's aboard his forthcoming offensive, or you can come out of the Colmar pocket and try for a grand encirclement of the 6th Army Group down there. So, and then there'll be finally be a 4th volume on Aachen, which is a real slam banger. You have 56 Panzer armies slamming into the American forces around Aachen. That's main power versus main power. There's a little maneuver there. It's a banger right away. So anyway, what generated this 4-game scenario, and I hope once they're all in the magazine, I can talk to powers who be at S&T Press into perhaps collecting them in a box as a deluxe treatment called alt bulges or something like that. But anyway, the street level ground wisdom is that in picking the Ardennes, Hitler picked the best of a series of bad choices. I've come to believe he picked the worst of a series of potentially better choices for him. Here he could have essentially, had he done this, he could have really simply knocked France out of the war again. Politically speaking, had the French lost Strasbourg, there's very little chance the de Gaulle government would have survived as anything other than a straight up military dictatorship. By attacking in the British, the volume 2 of this was the Holland offensive against the British. By coming out of the Venlo salient against the British at 65 miles, that is, the spearheads in the historic Bulge scenario went 65 miles. That got them to the Meuse River, where they stalled out. Had they gone 65 miles from the Venlo salient, they would have been in gun range of the docks at Antwerp. And then the first volume was Wacht am Oder, in which you launch a spoiling attack into the Russian lines, the Soviet lines in Poland at the time. And of course, there was no chance there of, it's not a reignition of Operation Barbarossa, but he could have set them back to the point where very likely, had he done so and put a big hurt on them, the Anglo-Allied and Soviet armies would have linked up somewhere closer to the Vistula rather than the Elbe. Okay, I guess that's. Oh, I had one correction I wanted to make to Aaron's introduction on me. I didn't used to be a senior editor at S&T Press. I am senior editor at S&T Press, and I'm also editor of Paper Wars magazine at Compass Games. When people ask me what is that is like, I say, well, it's like being a field marshal in both the Prussian and Austro-Hungarian general staffs at the same time. It can be somewhat delicate, but in general, there's no friction really. Was that my last slide?
That was your last slide, Ty. Sorry about that, making that error.
That's quite all right.
You have so many irons in the fire; it's hard to keep track of. So
many are confused by that. Yes,
I'd hate to see your day-to-day calendar, to be honest with you. And I just want to put a shout out for your 5 Battles of the Bulge alternate Bulge games. I had a chance to play the Op Holland one, and a lot of people don't realize what bad shape the British Army was in by late 1944, and if the Germans had hit them hard in that relatively more open terrain in the north, it's the possibility of knocking the British out of the war, at least offensively, was a real one, and that could have really changed the dynamic of how the war ended. I found it to be a fascinating game. That's going to be my new must-play Bulge game every December now. So.
Yeah, well,
December rolls around, you have to pull out one of the Bulge games, so that's going to be it.
I have become convinced that his choice of the Ardennes had really nothing to do with strategic logic. That is, I think it was at the Führer conference where he announced he was going to do that. I think it was like September 14th or something like that, which was like a week after Antwerp fell. And at the time, German units were lined up on the Scheldt estuary. And if you wanted to keep Antwerp out of play, all you had to do was reinforce them. I mean, you don't need to go through the Ardennes to get back to Antwerp, just reinforce the Scheldt River, and you could have done it. And so I think what he was trying to do was duplicate what he did in 1940 by coming through the Ardennes. He was hoping that Time magazine would pick him as Man of the Year again in 1944, to repeat that magic. Because you have to remember, at that point, he was having his sinuses swabbed out with medical grade cocaine every 3 days, and he was on a regimen from Dr. Morell of approximately 14 psychoactive compounds. And so I think he had fallen into magical thought patterns rather than strategic logic at that time. So that's my conclusion there.
Yeah. Several months had passed since he first decided to do that, and his staff did their duty with their staff work, but he wasn't going to listen to any of it.
No, indeed. But the staff work they did makes for excellent war games today. So.
Yeah, there you go. All right, Ty. Well, I'm going to drop you off and bring Joe on. And thanks, Ty. And let me just take Ty off. Okay, Joe, you're up next. And I have your bright, colorful slides, which is all my fault for making them bright and colorful. But they, as I said, I think they match his pictures very well. So, Ty, I'm going to drop off and just change your slides. It's all yours.
I mean, Joe. Okay. Anyway, welcome to another exciting day in wargaming. And let's see the next slide. Okay. So let's go back to the exciting days of October 1962, when the world was one eye blink away from a nuclear Armageddon. The game is Objective Havana, and the assumption is, what if the United States had decided to invade Cuba in response to the Cuban Missile Crisis? So, next slide, please. Okay. So there's the overall strategic situation. You can see here that the usual stuff with the radius of Soviet missiles being fired from Cuba. The U.S. historically instituted a quarantine, aka a blockade, but they didn't call it that because that would have been an open act of war, and they used that to essentially interdict the Soviet reinforcement of the island, and the crisis resolved itself with essentially the Soviets agreeing to withdraw their nuclear weaponry from Cuba. But what if the government did what many other Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted to do, which was to invade Cuba and take out Castro once and for all? All right, next slide. All right, there's a lot of good information on this one, including operations plans for actually invading Cuba with orders of battle. And this is a map. Somebody marked it secret and then scratched it out, but it shows basically various strategic targets on Cuba and what would have to be taken in order to gain something of a victory. All right, next slide, please. All right, the game is a solitaire game. I actually based it on my pre-1941 solitaire game, similar situation. You're invading an island with airborne forces and amphibious forces. The U.S. player is controlled by the actual player. The Soviet-Cuban side is played by the game system. Okay, so when you have solitaire games, you have to have a sort of board game artificial intelligence to run them. The way I did this is by giving the Soviet side a reaction index. The higher the reaction index, the more likely they're to do things. And this is generated by various random events. So the higher the reaction level, the better the events they will get, like massive counterattacks or attempts to storm Guantanamo Bay. Okay. When designing a solitaire game, there's always this problem of the whack-a-mole situation. The enemy shows up, you hit them, they show up again, you hit them. After 2.5 turns, that gets pretty boring. So what I like to do is add a meta level to the game. In other words, a way you can influence the enemy's overall actions. And in this game, the way that's done is that you can actually launch attacks against the communist reaction index. And this is done mainly by using airstrikes, which are not allocated to targets on the map, but instead to essentially enemy communications and enemy headquarters, not otherwise shown. But the problem is, of course, if you allocate air units to attacking the enemy reaction level, what happens is they're not available for tactical employment on the map. So there's sort of a balance of choices here. It makes for a much more interesting game. Do you want to go for the full strategic victory there by taking out the enemy's reaction index, or do you want to support your troops on the ground? There's another thing in the game, and that's called the escalation index. Right? The higher the escalation index, the greater the chance for World War III. Escalation index goes up by a number of things, mostly by causing collateral damage. Sometimes it goes down owing to random events. And you can also use psychological warfare to lower the escalation index. So again, you got to think about these strategic factors. And finally, you have additional reserves you can bring in. But if you bring them in, what happens is the escalation index goes up. The idea being that you're turning this into a bigger war. Also, you're pulling out forces from other parts of the world, which would be used to deter the Soviets from intervening. So again, you've got these little interlocking systems, and you got to bounce one off against the other. And often that's the most fun part of the game. Think of yourself in the Pentagon war room with people pushing markers around the big board. And if that is not enough, speaking of the Pentagon, you have Pentagon staff points. The idea is this represents your overall planning and communications ability. So you can allocate staff points to different things, like, for example, to enhancing the ability of airborne forces to make a landing in the correct zone, or to enhancing amphibious operations, or to various other game actions. So again, you've got a way to strategically manipulate what's going on. Now, back on the operational to tactical level, you'll note the game map is point to point. That's a lot easier when you're doing a solitaire game because you're not dealing with a bunch of hexagons. All right, the different shapes indicate different kinds of terrain. So you have cities, and you have beaches, and you have inland. And in the lower right, you have Guantanamo Bay. Okay, and then they're connecting paths. You'll also notice there's some areas have a little red airplane. Those are air bases, and you want to seize air bases for various reasons. When the communists do move their forces via reaction, you either place them on the map or you move them from point to point, and then that gives you a limited form of enemy action. And given the situation, it's kind of realistic because they weren't going to be planning any grand sweeping maneuvers. Another interesting thing here is that Cuba and Crete are pretty much the same in terms of overall geography, although Cuba's a heck of a lot bigger. It's a long, slender island. So again, interesting little comparison there. Okay. Can we go to the next slide, please? All right. One thing that was kind of fun in putting this game together was that this was the era of the Potomac Army. And this was the era in which the Army decided it was going to get into the future by organizing itself for operating in a nuclear environment. So what they did was they reorganized the infantry divisions into 5 battle groups. And each battle group was the size of a reinforced battalion. The idea being that, okay, they would move dispersed, but fight concentrated. And so what you would do then is have a situation where if somebody started using tactical nuclear weapons, the most you lose is one of these reinforced battle groups and not an entire regiment. The problem is when they tried this in field exercises, it didn't work too hot. But this is the unit organization, so I thought I'd throw it in just to make it interesting. Another interesting thing here is that the U.S. infantry and airborne divisions, because they're under this Potomac organization, have a very low reduced combat strength. Some of them will go down to zeros. Whereas the Marines, who have the old regimental organization, when they're reduced, they go down to like 2 strength units. So the Potomac divisions have more strength up front, but when it comes to sustained combat, they're going to start becoming ineffective. Okay, you also have plenty of air units, and the air units can either fight communist air units in the air, or they can conduct bombing missions against both targets on the ground and against the enemy reaction index. Plus, you have some naval gunfire, as usual. And also, you have some unconventional warfare units. And these include various special forces and SEAL teams, which can be landed and conduct various missions like raids and reconnaissance. You also have, if you'll notice the bottom left of the counter tree, you have some U-2s because this is the Cold War, and hey, what's the Cold War without U-2s, right? Okay, so you got some U-2 missions in there, and that can do reconnaissance. And why is this important? Because you place all the communist units on the map initially face down, so you don't know what you're up against. So you got to do recon to figure out what you're fighting against. Now, you'll notice some of the communist units have a little missile symbol on them. And these are units that have like Frog or other types of rockets. And so if you take those out, you get more victory points. You also have others, you can see in the upper right, which have a nuclear symbol, which represents a nuclear arms depot. The thing is, when you hit these units, they can actually raise the escalation index. So again, it's a trade-off. The brownish units are Soviet, the reddish are Cuban. And you'll notice there's some personalities there like Fidel, his brother, and Che Guevara. So you may meet some familiar faces somewhere up in the Sierra Madre. And finally, you have Operation Mongoose, which is a pro-U.S. Cuban guerrillas that can be committed to the island. And so they give you some additional guerrillas and plus a couple extra special forces guys. And you get the famous B-26 bombers, which were essentially the CIA's private proprietary air force. Okay, at the end of each turn, you make an escalation check. Basically, the index goes from 1 to 12. The higher it is, the bigger the chance for World War III. So you roll 2 dice. If the die roll is less than or equal to the current escalation index, World War III begins, and you pull up the map and you check your victory points to see how far you got ahead. And if you got enough victory points, you've won. If not, well, okay. And basically, you win by taking out the nuclear armed units, the missile units, and taking key objectives like Havana. All right, next slide, please. All right, this is Invasion Australia. It's the current issue of World at War magazine on the stands right now. And the idea behind this is, what if the Japanese decided to invade Australia in World War II? Now, there was a big debate in the Japanese high command. The Imperial Japanese Navy wanted to have this Australian invasion, take some important ports and cities in the northern part of the country and just basically hold them and for what long-term purpose was not really clear. But nonetheless, they felt they were within range of their operations. The Imperial Japanese Army objected it on two grounds. First, they didn't have the troops. Most of their ground troops are tied up in China or in Southeast Asia. They couldn't really muster the people to do another big land operation. There's also the shipping factor. The Army pointed out that they didn't have the transports to move people to the island, the big island, Australia, and then sustain them. And so the whole thing finally got scrapped, but nonetheless, it was on the drawing board. So next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. All right, this is the overall strategic situation. And basically, the game takes place sometime between April and July of 1942. At this point, the Japanese were on New Guinea, and they controlled the East Indies, and they were planning to move into the Solomons. So they actually had bases from which they could launch an invasion of Northern Australia. And bear in mind, they actually did bomb the port city of Darwin in the North Central several times. So there was a considerable amount of risk. In fact, the Australian government pulled its troops out of North Africa and the Middle East to defend the home continent. All right, next slide, please. And the other thing is that, the U.S. was in the war at this time, but for the most part was not really prepared to fight a sustained campaign on land. There still were numerous logistical issues, and also a lot of the troops still had to be trained up. So both sides are going to be fighting on something of a shoestring. Now, the map shows Northern Australia because that was within range of Japanese air power based in the East Indies and New Guinea and Rabaul. So how do you get to the island? Well, since logistics was a major factor in this whole campaign, I decided to use the system that was pioneered back in strategy and tactics oral war way back in the 1970s. There they used air transport points to quantify logistics. So to move units into the Persian Gulf region and seize the oil fields, you had to expend air transport points. And to keep them fighting, you also had to do the same. Well, I used a similar system here in Invasion Australia. Only you have logistics points. They actually represent your overall seaborne transport capabilities, getting back to the whole naval transport issue. Both sides have a very limited number of transport points. So it comes down to often a choice. Do you get people on the island, or do you keep them sustained and fighting offensively? So that's the big question there. You notice the map covers a lot of territory. Each hex is 100 kilometers. And each game turn can represent anywhere up to 3 weeks. The idea being that given the variabilities of combat, there's no one particular time scale. Another interesting thing about the map is that each side treats terrain differently. The Australians and their allies can move much faster along roads than can the Japanese. Why? Because the Japanese lacked the transport. Also, the Australians had a very well-developed plan to sabotage the infrastructure. So you take out all the gas stations, you evacuate the trucks, and so forth. So each side treats the terrain differently. And you also have the Australians have static militia, so that gives them extra benefits defending. But the Japanese also have the advantage there of basically a better air force. So can we see the next slide, please? Okay, and these are the game units. You'll see most of the movement factors are relatively low. And again, this uses the same system as Oil War, which, by the way, I later on used in Saddam Moves South and Desert One War. And it works quite well because both sides, you look at this and you say, oh, lots of units here, right? Well, no, I mean, trying to get them onto the continent, it requires a lot of transports. So what you need here is to expend a lot of logistics points. And those logistics points come very dearly. You'll notice some Japanese units have a little blue unit box. These are ones which can conduct an amphibious assault, which means directly storming a port. And there are also a couple of airborne units in there too, which are useful. Probably the most critical units in the game are engineers. Okay, you need engineers to build up bases. If you have a base, you can then use that to generate supply. If you don't have a base, your guys are out of supply. And since there are only a limited number of engineers, there's going to be a limited number of bases on the map. Okay. And this gets back to one of my big theses about warfare in the modern era. It's often a war of bases. Where you have bases, you can have logistics, you have command control, you have refit points, and you can stage your air power out of them. So getting your bases on the ground gives you everything else. I actually used a very similar system when I did the Angola game years and years ago, where the war becomes basically who can get their bases at the right place at the right time. Okay. There are also some special units in here. The Australians have a couple of commando units, and they can call in a New Zealand expeditionary force. U.S. has some units. You have the 1st Marine Division, and you also have a U.S. Infantry Division, and the infantry is kind of weak there because, again, it wasn't trained up yet to fight as an efficient fighting force. You also have air power on each side, and again, if you look at the factors, most of the Japanese air units are actually pretty good, mainly because they have long range. And since they have to stage out of either the East Indies or New Guinea, that means they can cover most of the map. Whereas Allied air power is often very short range, so they have to have upfront bases. And finally, you have naval power. And the way this is handled is with a random die roll. And the way it works is if you have naval supremacy, you then can bring in naval gunfires plus some carrier aircraft. Overall, victory condition is by seizing and holding various vital objectives on the map. So it's basically a game of terrain. All right, and that gives us the chance to explore what would have happened to one of the great what ifs of World War II. Okay, I think that's about it.
All right, Joe, thank you very much. What I'm going to do now is put everybody back on the stage, and including Trevor here, and we can do some Q&A. That's a lot of material. That was a tour de force of doing some counterfactual work there. If folks have questions, please put them in the YouTube chat, and if you keep them short, I can pop them up on the screen. I can't take a whole paragraph because it'll block us all out. It'll be too long. But I'll start with kind of the first question here. And I am going to pop it up on the screen here. Are there different challenges between doing what I call a grounded counterfactual versus standalone counterfactual? And let me explain that. A grounded counterfactual would be where you take an existing battle where you have a good historical record, Battle of the Bulge, Gettysburg, Waterloo, and you just change some variables in the game, right? You change leaders, you add some new units that maybe weren't there. There was a game like that just got published by was it Flying Pig Games, their Pike Creek, which is an addition to their Gettysburg game that they did. Vice doing what I call a standalone, which would be you're taking an op plan or a plan that was maybe drafted but never executed, Operation Unthinkable, some of the Soviet op plans for the 1950s that Ty has turned into games. Are there differences between those? Heck, the Cuban Missile Crisis game that Joe talked about was based on a real op plan that the U.S. military had but didn't execute. Are there different challenges between doing these kinds of games? One where you have a historical record you can work off, and other ones where you're kind of creating it out of whole cloth.
Yeah, I might just jump in real quick with an answer. I was thinking about Operation Sea Lion. In that particular case, we have a pretty good idea of what the order of battle was for the British defenders and the German attackers. And so you could do that as a standalone battle, or you could do a counterfactual on it where you might add other things. It was pretty much believed the Germans would not have success in that engagement, but you could add things in the Germans didn't have in the historical order of battle. So that, and to answer your question there, Aaron, in some cases on the hypotheticals, we know what the order of battle would have been if the engagement would have been fought. So then you just do a variant on that order of battle.
Yeah, Ty, do you want to add anything based on some of the Cold War ones that you've done where there were plans but no war?
Well, what drew me to simulating those Stalin's final war kind of things uh, was actually Bill Thomas at Compass made the suggestion. I started reading up on it. He said, "I think you're ignoring a very potentially interesting era." And it's essentially that era from 1945 to 1953, when with the advent of the hydrogen bomb. It was the last year in which those mass armies of World War II could have fought without being literally blown to bits, vaporized by hydrogen bombs. And from the days of our youth, if you remember the old Avalon Hill Blitzkrieg game, that was essentially the war being fictionally simulated in there, post World War II conflict, but fought still with that kind of mass army. So, okay, to get more directly to your question, the more likely something was to happen, the closer it came to happening in real life. I think the more pressure that puts on your victory conditions, and in terms of your shaping of the victory conditions, which in turn shapes the play of the game. Whereas the further away you get from an actual event, the more latitude you have in assigning victory conditions that allow for a greater competitive evenness. So I doubt if that answers your question.
Yeah, it's just interesting because when you're not grounded into something. Operation Unthinkable is what, like 3 pages long. Yeah, the one I looked at least the one I saw online, it's at the British Archives. I thought it was like only 3 pages long. Maybe it's longer. There's not a lot to work with there, so you're left to pick a lot of the variables yourself based on the British Army, the American Army, whatever at that time. Now, Operation Unthinkable was Churchill's idea for fighting the Soviets when World War II ended. It's not the first time that's been gamed. There's been other games on that topic. Heck, you can even go back to the old Battle for Germany SPI game. There was a scenario in there where you just duke it out with what's left of the U.S. and Russian army after you're done, whooping up on the Germans. So it's been done before. It just seems to me that would be maybe like a harder. It'd be more freeing in one way because you have everything open to you, but it's also more difficult because you got to make sure that it's a plausible scenario, or at least semi-plausible scenario.
Well, when you're doing that, I always try and gauge, at least to begin with, the two sides' capabilities with the closest real-world historical event I can match up.
Yeah.
For instance, in Operation Unthinkable, though that never happened, we do have the performance of all those armies during the final 6 months of World War II, and so that that gives us a general scope of their combat power. So I mean, we know the Soviets aren't just going to fold up, and that sort of thing. So you start with getting as close to reality as you can, and you work from there.
Yeah, Joe, anything you want to add on to that based on your experience?
Right. Well, when doing Invasion Australia, the Australians are pretty easy to get. In fact, there's some maps showing all the units where they were located. For the Japanese, it was a matter of, yeah. For the Japanese, a lot of it was simply saying, okay, what units were used for amphibious operations at this time? So actually, I have the units that were eventually used in the Solomons campaign and were intended for Midway being available, and then plus a couple of divisions from the units that were used to capture the East Indies. So you have a reasonably historical order of battle.
Yeah, the biggest problem with the Japanese, I think, as we all know, is that the Army and the Navy didn't get along. Army didn't want to play with the Navy didn't want to play with the Army, so it was only grudgingly the Army would send any units along, and only if they saw some self-interest in it. It was very hard to get them to play in the Navy's plans, so they would just leave us alone and fight in China. That's what we want to do. I don't have any other. I don't see any questions yet. So here's my next one, and then I'll let Here we go. How do you pick your topics? Is it just based on personal interest, or do you do reading that tips you off to this, or are there just areas that you want to try something that no one's worked on before?
All of the above.
All of the, or is it feedback from the magazines, right? You always have the tyranny of feedback in the back of all the wargaming magazines, right?
Indeed, all of the above. Yeah.
Well, let me give you a recent example. Way back in Strategy and Tactics magazine #2, when it was still kind of a fanzine, there was an article by this fellow named Jim Dunnigan called "More Tanks or Better Tanks," and he had a very good analysis of why assault guns were more efficient than tanks, especially if you're trying to fight a defensive campaign. So I filed that away, and I said, okay, one of these days it's going to be a war game. Well, I proposed it, and it got accepted, and now it's called Ostfront 1943. The idea is that it takes place in 1943, but you can build special markers which represent either essentially tanks, like especially heavy tanks like Tigers, or defensive type systems like self-propelled anti-tank guns. And then these provide modifiers to your combat, so you can explore this whole thing.
Yeah, I read someplace, I can't think of where, that the Stug 3 was the #1 tank killer in the German army. It wasn't all those big, expensive, easy to break down King Tigers and stuff. It was the
Right.
lowly Stug 3. So I don't know if it's probably the same thing you're talking about.
Well, another aspect of that is that in general, for every 2 turreted tanks you can build, you can build 3 assault guns. So if you think about that, if the Germans had gone that route, that would have meant they could have had 50% more armored fighting vehicles. Now, even if they would not have had the trained crews and the fuel to run those at the same time, think of the replacement capacity that would have given them. Like particularly in Normandy, as their divisions say are getting burned out, and you've got the assault guns there to replace those losses as fast as they're being taken. The U.S. Army would still be battering away at Saint-Lô today, So, and then that was all Guderian. He would not authorize that switchover, despite the fact that they had presented it to him. They showed him the figures, but he wouldn't do it because assault guns were artillery, and he was the chief inspector of panzers. And so
I haven't read his book in a long time. Did he mention that in his post-World War II?
No, in his own memoirs, he's the most brilliant guy ever. And
yes, of course.
There's other critical biographies of mine. And there's one called Guderian Mythmaker or something like that. And the guy gets really into it. He would not let that switchover in production take place because he would have lost command of those units. And he didn't have anything to do with the artillery. And so it was just another example of that infighting, inside Germany. Before I shut up, Trevor, I wanted to ask you about that what if thing in the bulge where the Germans put the tanks on. What are you concluding about the operational effects of that as opposed to the one-day tactical effects? Have you made any conclusions there?
Yeah, so it's interesting. When I publish these counterfactuals, I kind of put it out there for the Hive also to do their testing and share feedback. So that, as I mentioned, it's being published in War Diary 29 this week. In my play testing myself and with my group here in Southern California, what we discovered early on is that the Germans were able to batter their way through much more effectively, almost create a bulldozer and just keep grinding down American units. But we also saw that American play, which, by the way, to balance the American side, we allowed them to randomly bring on reinforcements a half a day early, sometimes a full day early. We figured that the Allied High Command, when they saw the full scope of the German offensive, would be even more faster in getting reinforcements there. Also more latitude with the British Army to cross the Meuse once the threat really escalates.
That's an excellent point.
You always have the variable to change on the other side too, to balance it. Yeah. And so over time, the effect of the Germans was less and less. We did see some strategic German victories where you got a full Panzer Corps across the Meuse, but we've also seen every single time Bastogne falls, very quick Bastogne falls. But when you get about halfway through, maybe not so. I have seen one hex of Liege captured and held successfully by the Germans, but beyond that, it doesn't seem to be as significant as one would think. I'm really curious to see when other people play this scenario and start posting some items on it, what they see as well. Different styles of play matter.
That's the Allied reaction thing. That's the kind of thing that's easily missed. That was going back to Dunn's original book, Second Front. Now that was his great flaw. He analyzed the Allied position and concluded that they should have invaded in 43. They had this superior order of battle. But he didn't take into account, well, what if Hitler decides to fight the war differently? In other words, he hasn't got those 1944 SS divisions on hand. So where could he get more divisions? Well, he could collapse the front in Russia and swing 2 Panzer armies over. That was Eisenhower's big fear. So when you allow one what if, you've got to go to the other what if, the other side, and allow them alternatives. So,
and I mentioned also about using variable platforms. So all my testing has been done in Bitter Woods, but one of my play testers, Pat Mulvey, who lives in Southern California, has taken the exact same scenario and done it for Ardennes 44. So Mark Simonich's version of the same battle. And so you can play it in different platforms and see if you might get different results.
Sure.
No,
I thank you for clarifying that. I don't pretend to understand tactics. My belief is that from battalion level down, it's all just chaos. And so I almost always design, if I can, at brigade and division level on up. I don't. In fact, I think one of the things that differentiates an elite army from a not elite army is that if at the battalion level you can still maintain order out of chaos, well, that's going to be an immense advantage. Whereas normally at battalion level, everything is chaos from there on down. That's the hinge between operations and tactics. Thanks for explaining that.
We have about 10 minutes left. We have 2 questions in the queue. One is from a ringer. I think a couple of you guys know who this guy is. This is Keith Powell, one of the developers for Decision Games. He's got a question about initial order of battles, vice extrapolating mobilization and reinforcements. How different that would be. So I don't know who wants to jump in on this one.
Well,
yeah, go ahead,
okay.
Joe.
It's like in the Invasion Australia game. What I do is essentially give both sides their historical potential force pools, and then you can just simply buy them by using your logistics points. Because the thing is that the critical thing isn't the forces you've got, it's the forces you can get onto the map. So then you can create your own order of battle.
I think another thing to keep in mind is there is not necessarily just one answer here. Whenever I can do it, I try to allow variables in there, maximum reinforcement, minimum reinforcement based on die rolls, or as I was talking about in that Operation Winter Storm game. You're the field commander, you don't know what you're going to get. So Hitler says, well, I'm going to authorize the pull out of Army Group A immediately, but now I expect you to counterattack and hold Stalingrad. Now I'm going to send you Army Group A right away, and I'm going to send you 5th Panzer Army. We're going to let Africa go down the drain. Now you've not only got to hold Stalingrad, but I want to see Soviet tank armies. So you build in these variables. There's more than one possibility when you go into what ifs, and the more you can build in, that's just ultimately you have to keep control of your complexity and your components. But the more of that you can build in. Also that lets you off the play balance hook. Like somebody plays, I played this game and the Germans, they don't have a chance. Yeah, well, did you get the big reinforcements? No. Oh, well, too bad you're really bad. So you always got to, leave an out for yourself to escape the play balance trap.
Yeah, if you're going to go counterfactual, go all the way, right?
Exactly.
have all the possible options. Why hold back, right? Yeah, Joe, you wanted something else? You had something else you were going to add there?
Yeah, one thing is useful is that you just make the reinforcements variable. So what to do is you roll the dice, and that tells you what turn it comes in on, and that settles that. And if you don't like it, well, you can play it again. So
yeah,
it makes each game unique. Yeah,
you have the luxury the real guys didn't have.
Right.
Trevor, do you want to add anything to that before I go to the next question?
I kind of mentioned some of how we did the variable Allied response in Battle of the Bulge, but what I would like to mention is in my article on C3I37 on the Russian campaign, we changed the German order battle significantly, but there's going to be an Allied reaction to that. So what we did is we upped the Lend-Lease going into Russia, because you wouldn't have to have Allied forces in North Africa. Those could get diverted straight to Murmansk and so forth. We also had the Allied invasion of Casablanca, Morocco, occur in Sicily instead, and so it accelerated the Allied response in the Mediterranean. And then in the 1945, and to represent the bombing campaign accelerating of Germany, we significantly slashed the German reinforcements that would have been received, both 45 and 46, to compensate that.
All right, thanks. Got another question here. this may end up being our last one. And this gets to an interesting, the counterfactual alt history approaches and what are essentially fantasy. And, to be fair, alt history sometimes approaches that. I mean, we look at the game Dixie, which might have been the first alt history war game. And there are others out there. One of Ty's most popular games is Case Geld, which may also be the only monster alt history game there is, because I think has 2 maps in it. Most of these games tend to be one mappers. Is there a line between what is historically possible? And I mean, you can take alt history and really you could derive that out of some of these historical fictions that we see, like Killer Angels and so forth, do the same thing. Is there a fine line between that and fantasy games?
Hard to define in hard-edged words and phrases, but it's like pornography. I know it when I see it. Do we need to draw such a hard line there? It's I mean, I would offer that the oldest alternative history game, Sea Lion, is actually much closer to fantasy, because the more you get into that, the Germans did not have the Air Force or the Navy to run that thing, and yet of all the topics that are out there, I mean, Sea Lion was one of the original oldest alt history games out, and it has that immediate acceptance level that's much higher than anything else, because it goes back to the Battle of Britain and Churchill's time. Oh, we'll fight them on the beaches. You're not going to have to fight them on the beaches, because they're not going to get past the Royal Navy. You don't have a bomber force that can reach anywhere. They weren't set up for it. So that, although I did find an interesting thing there. I've got an article coming up on July 12th. I think it was, Hitler went to Halder and he said, I just had a brainstorm. He says, could we use the paratroopers to invade and conquer the Isle of Wight? And if we would do that, we'd be able to put the Royal Navy base at Portsmouth out of business. And Halder and his guys looked it up. The staff guys looked it up. The British had 1 brigade on the island at the time, no motor vehicles whatsoever, 3 battalions of regulars, 1 battalion of home guard. And Halder came back and said, yeah, we could do that. We could take the Isle of Wight. And then our ships operating out of Cherbourg can get over and back within 8 hours total round trip, so we can go out at night. Then Hitler just let it drop after, they could have been possible. Now, the effects of the Germans, had they taken the Isle of Wight in July, August 1940, that probably would have led to the fall of the Churchill government. Halifax and those guys were pushing for negotiations at the time, and the big bombing raids on the cities hadn't started yet, and so there was a chance. I mean, the British could not have ignored that, taking the Isle of Wight. It's not like the Channel Islands, and so within the overall Operation Sea Lion plan, there was actually a kernel of reality that could have really worked for them. In the article, I've got the full orders of battle coming up, and just a big bonehead play that, like I say, Hitler thought it up, and then he just, let's bomb London. It'll be great.
He wasn't swabbing his nose with cocaine.
No, he wasn't on cocaine yet or anything. Some of these things you can't help but see the handicap in it. It just like his brain became clouded.
Yeah. Anybody else want to add into that?
Yeah, I might just mention Pat's question there. For example, let's say we take Harry Turtledove's novels on the conclusion of World War II and designed a game on that universe. Now that would be going into fantasy, because it's not based on any historical order of battle. Yeah, they're using Sherman and tanks and Mark IVs, but it's totally different where we're at now. Whereas most of our counterfactual work is based on historical orders of battle, historical weather, historical situations, and then changing something slightly, or coming up with a new operation like Sea Lion that didn't occur, but then testing that as an alternate.
Hey, Joe, anything you want to add to that?
Well, I think you talk fantasy, you're talking about parallel history as opposed to actual history. So you're saying that, what if let's say the Confederacy had won in there, and now you're off on a completely different tangent.
Yeah, and just to point out, Dixie was not popular in its time. It was one of the lowest rated games. I don't know if Redmond Simonson ever recovered from that, because it was one of his games. He didn't do a lot of games himself. But, in hindsight, it's kind of an interesting game. And some of the other old SPI games, I mean, I looked at the Avalon Hill games. They didn't have, that I saw, any games that were like counterfactual or alt history. It was SPI had kind of the first ones. And, I don't know, some of the old SPI games now would probably be considered alt history, after the Holocaust or an invasion America or something like that. Now with 40 years of hindsight that's passed, it's no longer the near future. It's now the long past. You could probably change the categories that they're in. The last thing I wanted to do before we close here is we didn't answer the question of this. Why is counterfactual wargaming important? And I'm going to let each one of you give me your answer to that. For me, it's the idea that history often hinges just on a few key variables. And if counterfactual analysis, wargaming allows you to identify some of those, I think that there's a value to that, particularly if there's second or third order effects from those, from the perspective of knowing the next war you go into, these are variables we need to look for. Now, obviously, some warfare is completely chance. Things happened, by chance, but a lot of cases, people did things, and if they had done things differently, we could have had a very different result, and we'd be learning different lessons from battles or wars than we have learned in our history books. So I'll turn that over to you. Each one of you can tell me why you think counterfactuals are important.
Aaron, you and I talked about this about 3 weeks ago when we were trying to set up this panel, and the idea being, look at the future. If we had the luxury of time and we were going into a military engagement today, play that battle out multiple times, and then do your counterfactual on that battle of what you would change. And so you could learn from it in the future, not just in the past.
Yeah.
But I do enjoy counterfactuals, one, from an intellectual, thought experiment perspective. It's so interesting and engaging. And then it's also kind of the scientific element of our hobby, of being able to change things up and do them differently and learn from that. And yeah, I just really enjoy that aspect.
Okay, thanks. Ty, Joe?
I just, in the competitive sense, especially when you're sitting down and not playing solo, you're playing with somebody else, it's a more free environment. For instance, a few years back, Joseph and I got to work together to come out with a new edition of the old SPI word sport game, which we called word sport Pentatonic. We set it in the era of Elvis Presley in his army, and in the game,
the Pentatonic Army, right?
Yes, and one of the great lost eras of American Army history. And in the game, since you're only commanding a sector of the front, depending on how things are going off to the north edge and off to the south edge, the American player will get different reinforcements at different times. And this is determined by a die roll as you're going on, because, as events are unfolding. And I guess it was on Board Game Geek, some guy had a comment on that. He was saying, like, how am I expected to command an army when I don't know what reinforcements I will get and where they will come in and when they will arrive? And just that there it is, historical wargame. The trouble is, some of these battles are so well scripted. I mean, like, you fight the Normandy campaign if you're the American commander, knowing that, well, 12th SS is going to be here, and, I can break out best here and that sort of thing. When you go counterfactual, it sort of opens the stage up a little more, and it tests you as a strategist, as opposed to somebody who carefully read the historical article or somebody's AAR online in that way. So I like that. I mean, when I play a lot, I get my butt kicked, but still, everybody.
It's kind of the same reason people like future sandbox games like the Littoral Commander series.
Right.
Where you can create your own scenarios, you're given the forces, and you can go and do what you want with them.
I like that kind of exercise. So don't get me wrong, I'm not repudiating any historical games. It's just that, I mean, like I say, I pretty much got the Normandy campaign memorized, so a little more freedom of action. Joseph.
Okay, Joe, you get the last word.
One of the things I'm always hearing is, well, what would have happened if X, Y, or Z happened? The thing with counterfactual games is now you can find out. So set them up, play them.
Great, thanks. And I just wanted to say, I said it at the beginning, and say it again. A lot of these have appeared in Paper Wars, S&T, World at War, even Modern War, and I think I buy those issues specifically because of those games being in them. I love the genre. I love the mental aspects of it, as you have all pointed out, the challenges that it presents. Because let's face it, the holy trinity of wargaming, Waterloo, Gettysburg, Battle of the Bulge, put whatever top three you want in there. Brant Guillory called it the holy trinity of wargaming. I was like, that's a great term. I was like, it's been done to death, and we need new challenges. And I love Battle of the Bulge every year. My grandfather was in it, but playing the same thing over and over again every year, I already know how far the German army is going to go. There's no missing Panzer armies in the order of battle that someone's going to find doing more research, right? So, the next thing is what else could we have done to them? So thank you very much. We've gone a little bit over. Thanks to the folks that asked questions. And guys, hang on after I hit end stream here on 3, 2, 1.
All right. Bomba out.
All right.